Welcome back to the 4th Annual Temirtay Contemporary Ukraine Program Conference, Decolonizing Ukraine in Theory and Practice. I'm Emily Channel-Justice. I'm the director of the Temirtay Contemporary Ukraine Program. I want to thank everybody who was here yesterday and thank everybody who has joined us today for the rest of the panels. Yesterday, we heard 2 excellent panels and an inspiring keynote lecture by Dora Khomyak. And today, we'll be diving more into U.S. policy, as well as taking a very deep dive into Ukraine itself in the 4th panel. I want to remind you that in addition to our in-person audience, we have a large virtual audience joining us today from around the world, and all our sessions are being recorded. Please do silence your cell phones before the panels. And please note for our virtual audience, all of our sessions are being interpreted into Ukrainian simultaneously. There's a link to the instructions to how to access the Ukrainian channel in the chat. Before we begin our first panel, I would like to introduce some opening remarks from Oksana Markarova, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of Ukraine to the United States. She sent these remarks in pre-recorded, and I want to thank Katerina Smogli for helping coordinate that. Thank you so much.
Good morning. Thank you for the honor of the invitation and greetings to all of the participants of Decolonizing Ukraine in Theory and Practice conference that brought together so much talent from academic, diplomatic, policymaking, and civil society circles. Let me thank the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, led by exceptional professional and a friend, Dr. Serhiy Plokhy, and the Temirtay Contemporary Ukraine Program, led by Dr. Emily Channel-Justice, for organizing the conference and creating the unique space for the important and timely discussions about Ukraine and its national interests. Today's event gives me a wonderful opportunity to congratulate the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute on its 50th anniversary. Since the day of its inception in 1973, the Institute has been playing a key role in promoting greater knowledge about Ukraine in the United States and globally. At the time when other universities refused even to offer Ukrainian language courses, considering Ukrainian to be a dialect, the Institute was the first, and for a long time, the only academic center in the United States with a unique mission of advancing knowledge of Ukraine through teaching, research, and publications. Today, the Institute is once again at the forefront of the important academic efforts of decolonizing Ukrainian studies and debunking the many myths about Ukraine and its history. We are immensely grateful to the Institute for its leadership and many years of service. Dear colleagues, in less than 20 days, we will mark the second very sad anniversary of Russia's brutal full-scale attack on Ukraine, and also 10 years since the Kremlin's illegal annexation of Crimea and occupation of our eastern territories. In the last 24 months, we saw numerous war crimes, atrocities, which leave no doubt Russia has genocidal intents and aims to annihilate Ukraine and our identity, our future as a free European democratic state. Ukraine, our brave soldiers and civilians, are fighting at multiple fronts, and disinformation, weaponization of history, appropriation of Ukraine's culture, and denial of our national identity, unfortunately, even after 2 years, remain the key avenues of Russia's criminal war against Ukraine. Thus, the question of decolonizing Ukraine and Ukrainian studies is at the fore of the efforts to restore historical justice and deny Russia any claims over Ukraine and our statehood. We at the Embassy of Ukraine in the United States attempt to play a modest but impactful role in educating the next generation of American policymakers about Ukraine's history, culture, the national identity. Since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion, our diplomats held more than 100 meetings with students and faculty of American universities. Last year alone, in partnership with the Ukraine House in Washington, D.C., we held almost 300 cultural and public diplomacy events, celebrating our cultural diversity, history, and traditions. Decolonization of Ukrainian studies is one of the key priorities of the Lysiak Rudnitsky project implemented by our principal cultural diplomatic organization, the Ukrainian Institute. Similarly, the initiatives of the First Lady of Ukraine, Olena Zelenska, the Ukrainian bookshelves, and Ukrainian language audio guides at the world's leading museums aim to ignite greater interest in Ukraine and also advance the international knowledge about our culture and history. In total, the First Lady has already donated 47,000 books about Ukraine and about Crimea to universities and libraries in 40 countries under the auspices of this Ukrainian bookshelf program. In the coming weeks, the Metropolitan Museum of Art will launch the Met Speaks Ukrainian campaign, which will feature Ukrainian voices reflecting on works of the biggest art collection in the United States. These are just a few examples of our diplomatic efforts to advance decolonization of Ukrainian studies, art, history here in the United States. And we are still just at the beginning of much longer and arduous path that will require efforts of Ukraine's many partners and many friends. And studying Ukraine is not just important for us to decolonize our history, but it's equally important for the world to realize and to analyze our region properly and to understand why do we fight like we fight now. Ukraine is key to the region, it's key to Europe, and should our partners study Ukraine as you do so in Harvard Institute, and should Russians study Ukraine before, they would never think that we would give up and will not stand for more than 3 days or a couple of weeks. They would understand that this fight for democracy and freedom is existential for us, and generations of Ukrainians fought this before us, and this is something that we have in our heart. So let me thank all participants of this conference for solidarity with Ukraine and your everyday work as Ukraine's cultural and academic ambassadors. You all make my work and my fellow diplomats much easier. I am absolutely convinced that after victory, we will have to create a special international platform, so-called Academic Ramstein, tasked with restoring Ukraine's academic potential and advancing the development of Ukrainian studies abroad, but also back home. Only together we can achieve victory on all fronts and protect Ukraine and our neighbors amidst all current and future threats. I wish you fruitful debates and all the best of success in your academic endeavors. Look forward to listening to all the panels and enjoying the great minds coming together at this conference. Slava Ukraini!
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ambassador Makarova, for making the time for us. Panel 3, as I mentioned, will focus on U.S. policy in Ukraine. Our moderator for this first panel is Oksana Shevel, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Tufts University and an Associate of the Ukrainian Research Institute here at Harvard. She is joined by Volodymyr Dumovik, who is also affiliated with Tufts University. He'll be joining us online. We have Eugene Fischel from George Mason University, Melinda Herring from Razom for Ukraine, and Benjamin Schmidt from the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you, Oksana, for your moderating. I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this important conference and to moderate this outstanding panel. They already promised to disagree with each other, so that should make it for a lively discussion. So the way the format, as those of you who were here yesterday are familiar with, so the moderator prepared a set of 4 questions that I will ask to each panelist in turn, and then they will answer, and then we will proceed to an open discussion. So, and we will go in the order listed on the program. So Volodymyr Dumovik will be our first speaker after I ask the first question. So my first question is this. I wanted to start with a somewhat provocative question, a claim that is repeatedly made by Russia and also resonates quite well with many critics of Russia, especially in the global south, that the US policy towards Ukraine is actually a form of colonialism. In the Russo-Ukrainian war, this argument goes, US is cynically pursuing self-interest in weakening Russia, in getting so-called control, quote unquote, of Ukraine, of its resources, And this deprives Ukrainian government of true sovereignty. So even if we agree that Russia is acting as a colonial power trying to control Ukraine, US is no different in this argument. So my question to the panelists is, how would they answer those who make such allegations? Through history in different geographic regions, US arguably indeed acted as a colonial power, but what are the key differences with US actions towards Ukraine now? And speaking more broadly, what are the criteria of colonial and anti-colonial policies pursued by great powers? And why is the US role vis-a-vis Ukraine now is not colonial? So we'll start with Volodymyr, who's joining us on Zoom.
All right. Hello. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Good. So let me first of all say that I might very well agree with what is going to be said after me by the panelists. I know them. So I don't think they'll be saying something that I would disagree. But seriously speaking, I mean, good to be there in the spirit at the CGIS South, where I spent so much time listening to very good presentations by others. Thanks for having me online for this conference. Thanks for all organizers. Obviously, first of all, to Huri, and then TCAP and Emily, Megan, and everyone who was involved. And it's such a great pleasure to be on a panel with some great colleagues and friends as Oksana, Jean, Melinda, and Ben. And let me also say at the very beginning that I'm very grateful as a Ukrainian to US as a country and the American people for support of Ukraine through this almost 2 years. Of this full-scale war. We might have our questions about what is given, what is not given, when by US to Ukraine, but at the same time, we all recognize and acknowledge the assistance and help provided by the United States to Ukraine at this time of utmost need. As for the question, Oksana, I should say that I don't even know why would we as a serious scholars be needing to entertain such an opinion, which is really a fringe and a radical one, and it's not really expressed by, by anyone who is serious, who has any kind of serious understanding and knowledge of the region or Ukraine or Russia or Euro-Atlantic security. So, but since the question's been asked, I think US has tried on many occasions to avoid the war. That's one thing. So it's not something which was cooked and prepared by the United States. President Biden was involved in some dialogue attempts and conversations with Putin for a long time before February 24th, 22, entire 21, and then even criticized for trying to actually establish some kind of dialogue with Moscow. In the last weeks before the aggression, also Americans tried not to provoke the war by refraining from giving Ukraine any weapons or putting sanctions on Russia when Russian troops were already on the borders of Ukraine. So I don't think the US is contemplating or planning this kind of war and pushing both Ukraine and Russia towards the war. On the contrary. Another thing is there is nothing really that US might frankly need in Ukraine in terms of resources. That's a really strange argument. Because Ukraine is actually needing a lot of resources, especially energy coming from outside. And that's where US, by the way, is helping a lot. And I'm sure that Ben would address that issue, perhaps because he's a prominent expert specifically on this field of energy policy. So it reminds me of some people who were saying that Iraq invasion by US or military operation in Iraq was also about oil. And I don't think so. And no one thinks so who has a serious understanding of the issues. I mean, US was never in a position to use that oil really. And, and the treasure that they invested in both places, Afghanistan, Iraq, many other places around the globe, in human lives, American lives, soldiers and resources was so enormous. So why would someone make such an argument? But people still make that argument. So in Ukraine, there is nothing for US to look for. US is already exporting actually tons of oil and gas, and so they don't need any of that. I don't see any examples of Washington undermining Ukrainian sovereignty. In the months coming up to February 24th, 22, the Washington was trying to push maybe Ukrainian leadership to make some preparations and steps in preparing for invasion by Russia. But Kyiv didn't, so that's, sovereignty. No one was dictating what to do. Later on, there were some disagreements, like last time around in the last year about the offensive, where Washington and Kyiv disagreed about the strategy for the offensive. When it comes to some negotiations, maybe a ceasefire, also the same thing. It's not just a mantra that Ukraine should make the decision. It's indeed a decision to be made by Ukraine, and no one is dictating. And Washington is basically patiently waiting for Kyiv to come up with their position, and they are testing the temperature often, like with the recent visit by Tori Nuland, I think, to Kyiv, among other things. She wants to understand what's going on in Kyiv, what is the mood, is some kind of negotiation, some kind of ceasefire in the works? How would Ukrainians react? Is it even possible? But Washington is actually watching Ukraine making decisions. So, and I can go on and on, but we're limited in time. But I think there's plenty of examples where Ukrainian leadership, even now, when needing so badly American assistance, is frankly making all of the major decisions by itself. So I don't see any attempts to undermine Ukraine's sovereignty by the United States whatsoever. On the contrary, helping Ukraine to defend its sovereignty against the only, and always, it was the only little threat and serious menace to Ukrainian sovereignty, which is Russian aggression.
Of course, share your opinion that this is not a compelling argument. As I said, it's more sort of devil's advocate, but unfortunately, this argument does resonate with a lot of global population, people watching Ukraine, governments in non-Western countries that are sort of on defense and haven't committed aid to Ukraine. So I think to hear arguments from all of you as to why this is not a good argument is actually helpful, even though, between friends, we agree that this is not a very compelling one. But we have a good list of reasons from you why it's not compelling, and I'm sure other speakers will add to it. So we now go to Eugene, if you'd share some thoughts with us on that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Oksana. I could just say I agree with Volodya, but I think neither you nor Emily would appreciate that approach. So first of all, greetings, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be back at Harvard, and also thank you for getting me out of Washington. Just a reminder that I am speaking in my academic capacity. I have another life that's more on the official side of things, but I need to underscore that, I think, for obvious reasons. Let me try to build on Volodya's points a little bit. He mentioned, of course, a few things that I wanted to point to as well. Yes, it is a provocative question. It's a good one to start the juices flowing, to get the juices flowing this morning. So I appreciate it in that sense. I think those who believe that the United States has a colonial approach to Ukraine have fallen victim to three aspects, probably more, but I'll mention three. One is ignorance. Second is anti-Americanism, which plays an important role. And then third is Russian disinformation. I don't want to drill down on the first two. I think they're pretty self-evident and explanatory. But the Russian disinformation is something that needs to be considered as playing a very active role in the way Russia tries to shape world opinion about its ongoing aggression against Ukraine. This one could spend much time talking about it. I won't. Maybe this aspect will come up later in other questions in the discussion. But I'll point out that Moscow very often, in addition to everything else, uses false prey to its own mirror imaging. When it talks about others, it often ascribes intentions to other countries, including the United States, that it itself would pursue if it were adequately positioned and resourced to do such things. In other words, sort of in short, if U.S. policy toward Ukraine is a form of colonialism, it's a new form, one that I hadn't been aware of. Now, of course, pursuing self-interest is normal for every country, and that's not to be confused necessarily with a colonial approach to any given country. The issue there in terms of self-interest is, what does that self-interest entail? What does it look like, and how does it affect the country at which that policy is directed? U.S. policy over the years, and we can debate how well resourced it's been or how effective, but U.S. policy toward Ukraine over the years has focused on supporting a sovereign, independent, prosperous Ukraine, not the elements of a colonial approach to any given country. This has been quite different, of course, from Moscow's approach. I don't need to tell this well-informed audience. Moscow's approach is very much colonial, and it's historically grounded in the sense that Moscow has had that approach to Ukraine for some time, does not see Ukraine and Ukrainians as having voice, agency, separate history, separate culture, separate language even from Russia and Russians. And that approach, that Russian approach to Ukraine goes up to and includes, of course, genocidal intentions. And if you think this is hyperbole and I'm just trying to be provocative, I would just point you to Putin's article, I believe, that was published under his name. Who knows who wrote it? His article in July of 2021, in which he alleged that Ukrainians don't exist as a separate people. That's at least rhetorical basis for genocide, and that's something that we should not take lightly, obviously. Another part of the question, if I understood it correctly, was whether the United States seeks to use Ukraine to weaken Russia. The reality over the years, and I'm sure there are many opinions about this, but the reality over the years is that actually the United States has not sought Ukraine has not advised Ukraine to weaken Russia. It's quite the opposite. If you look at the history of American administration, starting with Ukraine's proclamation of sovereignty on July 16th, 1990, moving forward, the American approach has been actually quite cautious to Ukraine, its aspirations, its security, and its interaction with Russia. If you look at the historical record at this point, the archival record, you'll see that most of the thrust of the American position over the years has been to seek a good relationship between Ukraine and Russia, between Russia and Ukraine. So again, the evidence is simply not there in this regard. And again, looking back, and I've done some work on this aspect, especially. But if you look at Ukraine's desire to become independent from the Soviet Union, denuclearization, the question of lethal assistance to Ukraine in the context of Russia's war, most recent war, which started in 2014, not 2022, of course, you will see that the U.S. approach has been very cautious and hesitant, and not at all seeking to take advantage of the situation. I know we'll talk about this later, but certainly Washington has not sought Russia's defeat even in the current in the current war. And in fact, you can hear voices sometimes in the background, sometimes more in the foreground, which talk about the risks of weakening Russia. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Let me wrap up my response here by mentioning a few other things. Even with the current administration, the Biden administration, the first policy that emerged from that White House was actually sought, quote unquote, stable and predictable relations with Russia. So it was very much a new version, somewhat maybe updated version of the reset that came out of the Obama administration. And the Biden administration actually tried to define its relations with Russia for the term of the administration through that effort. It was an effort that Russia rejected. The short of it is that Ukraine should be at the core of Ukraine policy in the United States. If the United States has erred in any direction, it's actually not recognizing that fully. When it comes to the so-called Global South, by the way, which is at the core of this question, Global South term is problematic in a number of ways, so I use it in quotes. Folks there, and you're right, Oksana, of course, that those opinions are out there. They need to understand that Russia is the colonial power in this dynamic, certainly, and those who side with Russia are siding with the imperial center against a former colony, which is something that should be not supported in the broader global South. Yesterday, and this is the final comment, there was a reference to Hrytsak and Shapoval, terrific historians and scholars, in terms of wrong empire, wrong colony. Academics can always debate terminology and definitions and things like that. I won't do that here, other than to suggest that maybe not wrong empire, not wrong colony, maybe different empire and different colony, in the sense that just because Ukraine is not overseas from Russia, it doesn't mean that Ukraine was not a colony, has not been a colony of Russia. In fact, early empires, before the invention of ships, of boats, of floating platforms, if you will, early empires were land empires by definition. So that does not take away from the argument that Russia is the colonial power and Ukraine has been the colony. And then finally, a plug not to use the term war in Ukraine. War in Ukraine is essentially a Russian disinformation phrase which seeks to limit the true nature of this war. And geographically, it's no longer in Ukraine. Russia has managed to help bring the war to Russia itself. So it's, if anything, it's war against Ukraine. Putin is trying to destroy that country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean. These are all excellent points, and I do reiterate your last. The terminology matters a great deal. This war in Ukraine, conflict in Ukraine. If I had a penny for every time I heard this, I would be rich. But let's move on to Melinda Harding, and she will tell us what's what.
Thank you for that setup. Okay. Good morning. So I work for Razum for Ukraine, and I am very proud to do that. And we had a wonderful keynote last night by Dora, and I think she really lifted our spirits and gave us practical things to do. There's much work to be done. But I am more comfortable representing myself. I was a think tanker for many years, so I'm going to put that analytical hat back on. Razum has many opinions, and I think that's one of the strengths of the organization. So I'm just representing me. So we promised Oksana to disagree. So here we go. Okay. I agree with Volodya that the right answer to this question is LOL. On its face, it's just kind of dumb. But then I thought about it after I got mad, then I thought about it some more. And I disagree with Jean. Part of the critique is correct. So the U.S. is pursuing its self-interest in weakening Russia. If you look at the assessments, Moscow's losses have set back the modernization plan of the Russian military by 18 years. That is definitely in U.S. national interest. Russia is a unreliable nuclear superpower that doesn't think much of us. So this is a good thing. But the false part, though, is we're getting control of Ukraine's resources and using them. This on its face, like we can just. I just want to ignore it. But okay, if you ask me to do sort of a back of the napkin, what would U.S. colonial policies look like? So is the United States enslaving people in Ukraine? I don't see any evidence of that. Have we set up an administrative state? No. Are we plundering their resources? No. So I think part of the critique is true and part of it's false. But on the we are pursuing our self-interest in weakening Russia, Volodya made a bunch of good points already, but the basic point is the Ukrainians want to fight. They are asking us and begging us for supplies and weapons. We're not forcing them to do anything. And Ukraine determines when the fighting stops. This is U.S. policy through and through. We say this all the time. It's so boring, but it's so true that Ukraine is in charge. It's in the driver's seat.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay. That was very succinct. Okay, excellent. So we will move to Benjamin Schmidt for the last.
Well, thank you, everybody, and it's great to be here. I just got back from Europe about 9 hours ago. So and argue just out of just because I think it's somewhat ironic. I was at a European Energy Security Conference in Bonn, speaking about critical infrastructure protection of energy and critical infrastructure in Europe. And had to leave early because the very train line that I needed to take to get back to the Frankfurt airport had been sabotaged earlier that day, and the power lines were cut. So we don't know who did that yet, but maybe someone didn't want me to get here and debunk what should be a question that does not need to be answered. But
the colonizers. Yes.
So yeah. Anyways, thank you. It's great to be back here at Harvard, and I don't feel like I've really left it, being still part of Huri, and it's just great to see so many friends and familiar faces here. I have been called a U.S. imperialist power for many years, talking about European energy security and European and Ukrainian energy cooperation on panels when we were debating the U.S. opposition to the Nord Stream pipeline. Very, very clearly, and there is YouTube evidence to show this, that this has actually been called an imperialist power, and then pushing back on that, saying, well, no, you're not a benevolent imperialist like Brzezinski. You're this and that. So I'm well acquainted that this actually is an argument that needs, unfortunately, to be debunked constantly. And so for all of the reasons that have been said, no, the U.S. is not pursuing an imperial or a colonial, in this case, policy vis-a-vis Ukraine. I do think it is in our national security interest that we support Ukraine in the sense that it also weakens the Russian military machine. But that is not a function of colonialism. That's a function of de facto policy, in the sense that that's actually what's going on anyhow. But that is not what's driving the support. What's driving the support, again, is Ukraine is asking us. Ukraine is asking us for sanctions. Ukraine is asking us for weapon systems. And they are happy to fight with this support, not asking for U.S. boots on the ground. So I think that is really important to point out. I'm trying to do this without the inevitable whataboutism to get back to who actually is who is the colonial power in Ukraine, and I think everyone in this room knows who we're talking about in terms of the Russian Federation. But let's just step back and kind of to just build out a little bit on what's been said by the other panelists. Since 2014, when Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine, legal annexation of Crimea, and invasion of eastern Ukraine took place, whether it was the Obama administration or the Biden administration now, we've seen that these policies have had realist foreign policy influences of realism, political realism. Towards the Russian Federation, the idea of spheres of influence and this sort of thing keep rearing their ugly head, whether it's in the academic world or in the highest levels of power in the White House, and of course the Trump administration in between. At a political level, of course, there was a very strange and concerning and still concerning affinity towards Putin as an imperial strongman to begin with. So all of this together kind of points out that we have not led a colonial or imperialist viewpoint towards Ukraine. If anything, especially in the Obama and Biden administrations, there's been a push from some in academia that support this sort of foreign policy, and some in the administrations, that when we talk about the transatlantic relationship, the United States needs to, quote unquote, lead from behind, or in the back of the room, or outside the room, peering in through the cracks if possible. And part of this is driven by accusations, as I said earlier, of the U.S. overstepping its role in the transatlantic relationship, and this idea that that we are somehow not being benevolent imperialists to support Europe. And some of this is argued again in classical political realism, argued by colleagues across the street from this very room. So it's something that I certainly have been concerned about. And then to just kind of put a bow on it in terms of the energy point of view, it's as Gene said, it's projection. It's projection by the Russian Federation. This is always what we run into when we hear Russian disinformation. It's whatever the norm is, the normative structures of Russian foreign policy. That generally is what we are accused of. And again, that's what I'm trying to avoid the whataboutism, but here we are. And the biggest thing was for example, our opposition to Nord Stream 2, we were constantly pushed back on by Russian officials, by Gazprom employees, or by pro-Gazprom German business organizations, all of which kind of sing from the same hymnal and have done so for many years. That this is the U.S. wanting to sell its LNG and does not actually care about European security, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the point of the matter I always point out is we don't have state-owned energy enterprises in the United States, whereas there are in certain locations in Europe and certainly in the Russian Federation, where the political folks in power can pick up the phone and call Gazprom and say, wouldn't it be nice if you sent a cargo of LNG, or I guess in that case it's not Gazprom, or send a volume through pipeline monopoly positions to a certain country at a certain price, or cut off this or that, and have these sort of political decisions in energy. Well, I worked as a European energy security advisor for 4 years, and I can tell you for a fact, if I ever picked up the phone and called Cheniere and said, wouldn't it be great if you sent a cargo to the Klaipėda terminal so that the United States was the very first LNG supplier to Lithuania's new ability to finally be, undermining Russia's monopoly in its market, didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen is we operate on an open market basis. Again, that's projection. We don't have an America prom in this country, and nor should we. So I will just say that certainly is the case. I hope we'll talk a little bit about sanctions and how that plays in as well. And the one last thing I'll say is I was at the COP28 conference in Dubai, I guess just a little over a month ago, and flipping through the channels, as I often would do in Europe before it was thankfully and mercifully banned. Russian state-owned RT is still going well and strong in countries, and this includes in the United Arab Emirates, where they are pushing very much all in on trying to push these narratives in the global south. And so this is exactly what's going on. Of course, they don't have commercials But what they do currently have, or at least had about a month ago, was between their propaganda and disinformation, quote, news segments, they would have a commercial, quote unquote, which was actually a 90-second explainer video pushing disinformation on Western imperialism, and or going back and finding threads of actual colonialism from, you know, the 1500s, the 1600s, et cetera, which of course are, you know, there's all sorts of atrocities to cover at that point, but certainly not having a commercial where they show what they're doing in Ukraine right now. So anyways, with that, I will just pass it back to the moderator. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Ben. I think these are all fantastic points. I think this projection that Russia basically projecting its own colonial intentions and behaviors on the US, I think is very important. And I think for all of us, especially academics working on colonialism, imperialism, anti-imperialism, I think the definitions of the terms is also very important, because these terms are thrown around to refer to all sorts of policies, right? Like you said, self-interest, the difference between self-interest and colonial intentions, right? So I think that's also very important. You did, I think, fantastic job debunking this argument with specific, like, factual arguments. But I think for academics, there is also a challenge to kind of, like, what exactly is colonialism, right? The kinds of policies that fall under this umbrella and policies that clearly don't. And I think once that is clear, it also makes it, you know, useful tool for fighting this sort of Russian narratives, how US is pursuing colonial intentions in Ukraine. Okay, so with that, let me move to my second question, which is about kind of contemporary developments. The last several months, the news have been dominated by US Congress' inability to pass legislation to send military aid to Ukraine. And that has created a major problem for Ukraine's war effort that grows arguably more dire by the day, as the frontline troops are experiencing ammunition and weapons shortages. And even if the aid is eventually approved, there is a broader question: is the West really committed to Ukraine's victory? So that's kind of the core of my second question. Ukrainian leaders and citizens, of course, have been very grateful for Western aid and US aid to Ukraine, but they widely believe that the aid has not been sufficient, causing Ukraine to fight, as some have put it, with one arm tied behind its back. And for most in Ukraine, Putin's genocidal intentions are very clear, as Ambassador was also referring in her remarks. So that's not sort of a puzzle, as is the fact that in Ukraine, Russia is also fighting against the West and its Western values. And Western leaders have been reluctant to send more powerful weapons to Ukraine. In general, they seem to be afraid to quote unquote provoke Russia, perhaps out of fear of the conflict escalating to a nuclear standoff, perhaps out of fear that Russia might disintegrate if it were to, quote unquote, lose. And then again, all sorts of terrible things for the West would come to be. But Ukrainians believe that unpunished aggression is what actually causes Putin to escalate. And if he's not stopped, he will continue escalating, both within and beyond the borders of Ukraine. But again, many in the West, including in the US, do not seem to share this view. And contemplate some kind of possibility of compromise to Russia, yes, helping Ukraine not lose, but also not really helping it to win. So my question is, do you agree that the West is actually not committed, and US specifically not committed to Ukrainian victory out of these kinds of fears, or perhaps some additional fears? Why is that? And what needs to happen for the US and other Western allies to join more determined states, such as the Baltic and Nordic states and Poland, and actually commit to Ukrainians' victory? So again, we'll go to Volodymyr Dubovik first.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Oksana. That's a question, the question. I mean, the most important one. I mean, I would probably like to divide the answering the question in the first part being like what's happening with the bill to support Ukraine in the Congress, and we'll probably be able to get back to this issue along our conversation later on. But in terms of what Washington desires at the end game for this war, that's an open question. I think that there have been a lot of ups and downs in how this administration, Biden administration, saw this war over the last 2 years. There's been a lack of maybe persistence in the sense of working towards one goal. So in that respect, I actually tend to agree with some people on both sides of the aisle, and some experts who tend to think that there's not enough of strategy in the sense of what's going to happen, what should happen, what the U.S. would like to happen in this war. And I personally liked the statement in the spring of 22 by Secretary Austin when he said that the goal is to weaken Russia. And more importantly, he continued, to the extent that Russia ceases to be a threat to Ukraine and others in the region. That's a really good goal. It's a guiding principle. Unfortunately, White House at that point of time walked back those remarks, and that's unfortunate because he was right on the point. That's exactly the goal. It's not to defeat Russia. It's not to disintegrate Russia. It's not to humiliate Russia. It's to weaken Russia to the extent that it ceases to be a threat to its neighbors. So it's a noble and reasonable goal. It's not a strategy in itself in one sentence. Yes, of course, strategy would be something more detailed and nuanced, and you would explain like how you want to achieve that. And that was lacking. So therefore, there've been a lot of hesitations back and forth and flip-flops and ups and downs. So it's one moment is euphoria. Ukraine is winning. Russia is being defeated. It's hooray. It's great. Another moment is doom and gloom. Like the Ukrainians are losing their guys near Bakhmut. Why are they doing this? So it's been a lot of unnecessary unevenness, uneven kind of approach, I think, also to this situation. It's a long war. It has become clear there's going to be a long war. So you need to sustain the line, and you need to see as they say in my part of the world, the light in the end of the tunnel. So you need to see what you're working to. And would Americans don't like Ukrainians winning? I don't think so, because it's never been the victory for Ukraine in the way that you would have, let's say, Ukrainian American soldiers marching in victory parade in Red Square. No one ever thought of victory of that kind. So we're going back to what we discussed for the last 2 years on the countless roundtables and panels, like what is victory, what is win, what is loss, what is defeat, and how many shades, like 50 or more of those terms you can find, because there are many. Some people say that the very fact that Ukraine is still standing there with 80+% of territory is a victory for Ukraine, when standing against this massive assault by Russia. And that's a point of view which is very valid, except that, of course, we want to liberate the occupied territories. But to Russia as well, even if they withdraw from Ukraine, which I don't think is going to happen anytime soon entirely, they would be able to say, look, but we've actually fought against entire NATO and fought quite successfully, again, there was no American or Ukrainian tanks in the streets of Russian cities, so probably it's victory for Russia. So that's how relative the terms victory or loss is. And I don't think the administration would like Ukraine to lose or something, but for Russia not to lose entirely in a most excruciating manner, probably so, primarily because of fear of destabilization and disintegration of Russia. And of course, the nuclear issue would be part of it, nuclear weapons in the territory of Russia. Historically so. Because by my first degree, actually, I'm a historian, and I teach a course on history of US foreign policy. It's always been the case. Like in 1905, for instance, the Theodore Roosevelt being president, he's been an ally to Japan in the Russo-Japanese War initially. But after the revolution of 1905, when Russia was on the verge of disintegration, suddenly policy changed. And that led to Portsmouth Peace Treaty, which Japanese actually thought was premature and unfair, and that began the era of growing tension in U.S.-Japanese relations, actually, which led to Pearl Harbor. And then in 1919, disintegration of the Russian Empire was a major issue to be discussed at the Paris Treaty, at the Paris Peace Conference. And then, of course, even after Second World War, the Cold War was beginning, and yet at the same time, the State Department issued in 1947 the document which said, no, we shouldn't really support Ukraine's independence or autonomy, or shouldn't recognize diplomatically Ukraine. It's just futile. And one guy wrote in the State Department in a memo that thinking that Ukraine might actually separate one day would be something akin to thinking that the Great Lakes area of the United States would go and become a new independent state. And of course, the Chicken Kyiv speech by President Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush. So, and that's ongoing. The worst fear always in this area of the world was disintegration, destabilization of this massive space, which is Russia. And therefore, actually, it's undermining the main narrative of Russian propaganda that West and US in particular is out to destroy us. No, that's not true. And actually, I would say even more that we in Ukraine might not like this scenario of massive chaotic disintegration of Russia, because it also would be dangerous to us. The monolithic, aggressive, belligerent Russia is a threat to us, but the massive disintegration of Russian space would also be a threat to Ukraine, geopolitically, security-wise, and so on. So again, for Ukraine and US, the goal should be liberating Ukrainian territories. And are we there? I don't know. Unfortunately, Ukraine, I must say, there is a growing sentiment that despite, we're grateful for what's been given to us by US, but like you said, fighting with one hand behind the back. And, we're feeling that maybe there is some backstabbing going on. I mean, as an expert, I mostly disagree, but as one of the Ukrainians and knowing the public sentiment, I should say that you should be aware that there is a growing sentiment in Ukraine among the people that we are not giving what could have been given. Anytime we hear about some weapons that needed badly by Ukrainians right now being scrapped and destroyed in US instead and not sent in Ukraine, that's really brings people to this view that maybe someone doesn't want at this point for Ukraine to go forward and defeat Russian troops. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Volodya. I think your point that what sort of exactly victory is and how do you define it, and there is some unclarity on that, I think it's very important because you absolutely agree with what you said, that, Ukrainians are not planning on marching to Moscow. I mean, for Ukraine, it is liberating their legally recognized territory, right? But then again, I think in the West, if the fear is either nuclear escalation and or Russian disintegration, many believe that even that goal is too ambitious, right? In other words, too risky. So it's not even that you don't need to try to march to Moscow, for Putin to threaten, use nuclear weapons. If they lose Crimea, right? Like if they lose, I think the more time goes, this argument would be applied to the occupied territory because they're now constitutionally part of Russia. Again, hypothetically, nuclear umbrella would extend to, parts of Zaporizhia that is occupied, so forth. So I think, so it's not a very maybe encouraging answer, but I think that you gave, but it is a very thoughtful one. So we will move on now to Jean Fischel.
Thank you, Oksana. Let me follow up very quickly. So the part of the question that I focused on is the West really committed to Ukraine's victory? A loaded question in the sense that the word really is present there. So it hints at perhaps where the center of gravity is in terms of the response. It's a great question. There's an obvious answer, especially because of the word committed. No, the West is not committed to Ukraine's victory. That's my short answer. I'll unpack it in a second, but I should also respond to Melinda since I have the mic. We promised to try to disagree, so I'll say that I agree with her when she disagreed with me earlier. If that works for everyone. No, I just wanted to underscore that it is in the U.S. self-interest to weaken Russia, which is not very good at it. We're not fully committed to it, and we don't understand what's at stake. So let me try to develop that in this. So actually, I think I agree with you in the final analysis. Just to make it clear in terms of what I intended to say. So unpacking this a little bit, we have to be fair in terms of trying to contextualize this. The United States and others have done a lot to support Ukraine, probably more than people would have anticipated before the large-scale invasion. There is a growing understanding in terms of what's at stake in this war. It's growing. I'm trying to kind of capture the process and the dynamic. We're not there yet in terms of the full appreciation of it. Being committed to Ukraine's victory requires many elements. A couple of them it was mentioned previously. One is strategy, and another one is resourcing. We're not, in my estimation, speaking in my academic capacity, we're not yet there in terms of strategy and the resourcing issue. Oksana referred to it in her question, but the resourcing is still not there as well, especially the long-term resourcing that is needed to defeat Russia and Ukraine, to secure Ukrainian victory. This is going to be a multi-year effort, obviously. So yes, the United States, I'll focus on the United States specifically, has supported Ukraine in very appreciable ways, but has often done so reluctantly and after critical delays and lags. And we're watching one of those delays and lags now as well. The framing has been off in my personal view. It's often it's off. It's self-limiting. There's not still a full understanding of what Putinist Russia is about and the threat that it carries to broader Europe. The threat goes well beyond Ukraine, as this audience knows. Putin preys on weakness and is very opportunistic. I'll just use one example here in terms of some of the discussions that are taking place near and far, the focus on supposed negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. Those who advocate negotiations at this point, in my view, are engaged in wishful thinking. They're also carrying Moscow's water for the Kremlin when they talk about negotiations under these circumstances. I should also point out that the West, of course, is not uniform in its views. There's great variance there in terms of approaches and commitment and resourcing. Some are committed, especially those more committed than even the United States. Those close to Ukraine, certainly. I could name a few. Others at the end of the other end of the spectrum fear Ukrainian victory. The common thread among those who are skeptical is that they still don't understand Ukraine, its importance, and its role in wider Europe. I would also underscore that helping Ukraine is not an act of charity. Ukraine is the shield, at least the conventional shield of Europe. We should never lose against Russian aggression. We should not lose sight of that. This is where I should mention Sherm Garnett. I think the last position he held was dean at Michigan State University, but he wrote a book in the mid to late 90s that called Ukraine the keystone in the arch of Central and East European security. I think he was right on target then, and if anything, Ukraine has become that even more so. We need to understand that, and we also need to understand that this is a must-win in terms of Ukraine, and it's a terrific opportunity. Going back to the question of American self-interest and self-interest of various European states. I should also point out that this war, Putin's war against Ukraine, unprovoked war, is a wake-up call for the United States and the rest of the West in terms of how unprepared it is, in a conventional sense, in terms of sustaining a multi-year war, especially as we look at other potential adversaries around the world. When we talk about the United States pursuing, and Ben mentioned this already, or taking into account realist approaches to foreign policy, in my view, it's actually unrealistic. There are many reasons why a realist foreign policy, as it's referenced, is unrealistic. I won't mention them all. I'll mention a couple. One, in this day and age, not taking into account what the people want, what the Ukrainian people want in this case, and the fact that they have agency and voice is not very realistic. Another aspect that's not realistic in terms of our foreign policy over the years has been that we've gotten very little for it. If you look at the investment that we made into relations with Russia, it has not paid off. In fact, things have gotten worse, and one of the reasons why Putin today is pursuing this expanded war against Ukraine, arguably, is Western policy and inability to deter Russia in meaningful ways in earlier years. A couple of recommendations. I'll throw them in now, and then I'll stop. There are several things that need to be done. We need to drop the near abroad mentality. The term near abroad, hopefully used only in quotes, but even then it's problematic. We need to get away from that term. It's a Russian disinformation term, and it does. When people use words matter. They affect analysis. And when we talk about near abroad, we actually we hamper our own policy approach to the region. We need to accept Ukraine as an integral part of Central and Eastern Europe. It's not something that's beyond Eastern Europe, certainly. We need to consider regional security needs outside the Russian prism, i.e. Ukraine needs to be fully integrated into our security strategies, resourcing, and projections. We need to understand that Ukraine is not a one-off. Ukraine is a particular case, certainly in Putinist rhetoric, but all of Europe is under threat. I'll leave you with the following quote from the president, actually, from a few days ago, because it's I can give you sort of evaluations and assessments, but I think in his own words, it's important to underscore how the White House tries to come close to supporting Ukrainian victory. It would certainly take Ukrainian victory, I suspect, but still, in terms of verbiage, it falls short. I'll just quote the president there here. We are also working for peace, security, and dignity for the Ukrainian people, who are demonstrating incredible bravery and resilience against Putin's aggression. So peace, security, and dignity, but not victory and not Russia's defeat. I'll leave you with that.
Thank you very much, Dean. It is somewhat depressing, but useful to know. And in a way, if there was something kind of maybe more optimistic to take from your remark, you notice, and I think it's an important point, how this perception is evolving, right? It's not sort of fixed in a way how Ukrainian victory or the possibility for victory is perceived and what kind of strategy US does. More serious weapons have been provided over time, all of this. So in some sense, maybe one could say, well, perhaps it's a matter of time, but I'm not sure that's really the way to look at it, but would be interesting to, maybe it will come up further in the discussion. Melinda Herring, we go now to you.
So unfortunately, I can't disagree with Jean this time. So Oksana, you've asked two questions. Is the West really committed to Ukraine's victory? And I have to be a little bit of a pedant. And the question is, how do you define victory? Volodya said that. And if victory is the restoration of the 1991 borders, the answer is unfortunately, sadly, no. And that is seen in the language that Jean just described and some other language from the president. But also, I think in the president himself, you have to understand where President Biden is coming from. This is not a defense of him. This is just to explain who he is. So Biden fears escalation. He grew up in a generation where in order to be a prudential leader, you were always thinking about the nuclear threat. And he has decided to ramp up to keep giving more and more weapons until the Russians overreact. Is that the right approach? Is that the approach we would take at this table? No, but that's where we are. The change in language that sticks out to me, we saw for the first about 15 months, the White House would say we have to stand with Ukraine as long as it takes, as long as it takes. And a lot of us, I think in this room, criticized that language because we thought it was wishy-washy. Well, you may have missed it, but they've changed their language. It's even worse now. The language they're using now is as long as we can. And that's much worse. That means that President Biden is reflecting the reality on Capitol Hill. Volodya, with love and respect, I would say that the goal is not just to liberate Ukrainian territories. We need to add real security guarantees to our definition of Ukrainian victory, or it's not going to be enough. Now, the second part of your question is the hard part. What needs to happen for the U.S. and other Western allies to become more like the Baltic states? So I would love to hear what the guys have to say about this. My list is not a very pretty list. America likes a winner, and Ukraine needs to be able to regain more of its territory. And we didn't see that in 23 for a lot of reasons. But a lot of the blame for Ukraine's inability to prosecute the counteroffensive is on us. We sat on our hands. Why didn't we send Ukraine the weapons? Why did we allow the Russians to build those fortifications in the 4 occupied oblasts? It's going to be incredibly hard to get through the trenches and fortifications that have been built. And we should be honest, we are a big part of the blame. We haven't seen revelations of war crimes as much as we did in the first year. And this is an ugly answer, but the revelation of war crimes motivates people to continue the fight for Ukraine. Another ugly answer, the West will care if there are real attacks on NATO. So if more missiles hit Warsaw, if more missiles hit in Vilnius, that's going to scare Western Europe. And then one other answer is, I think that if the Russians interfere in our elections in the United States, and it's really obvious, that's going to cause a certain segment of the population to rise up. I wanted to comment on one other question. Ambassador Markarova said, with a big smile and a well-deserved smile, that the Western experts were totally wrong, that the U.S. government assessed that Ukraine would fall in 3 days. And I was reflecting on what Kimberly said yesterday and how we don't have enough Ukraine experts in academia. And this is true in government, too. So one of the questions I've reflected on over the past 2 years is, why did we get our predictions so freaking wrong? And if you go and look at the people who count tanks and count weapons, these people are all experts on the Russian military. There are 2 experts that I can think of, Jean may know more, who actually specialize in the Ukrainian military. 2, and none of them are in the U.S. government. They're all sitting in think tanks writing little papers. So we have a big problem. We need to have more expertise on Ukraine in the Ukrainian government. We need to have more expertise specifically on Ukraine, particularly in the military sector.
Thank you very much, Melinda. This I do hope maybe we can go for just literally a sentence or two back to after Ben speaks to Jean and Volodya, that second part of the question that you elaborated on, what needs to happen for the US and other Western allies to become more like the Baltics, right? And really commit to Ukraine's victory. So Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, so as a sometimes writer of little think tank papers, I agree with you. I will just say, I think it's worth noting something that is really in the the political self-interest in the United States as well. That America loves a winner, right? Melinda pointed that out, and that's something that's always bugged me with this entire as long as it takes, and then even more dreadful, as long as we can. If the notion is that there's a risk that a second Trump administration would abandon Ukraine, that we would run into Ukraine fatigue in the future down the line, or trying to have this self-fulfilling prophecy that there already is so much Ukraine fatigue that we need to put Ukraine at a negotiating table on Moscow's terms, which, by the way, I think would actually be a colonialist or imperialist move by the United States if we were actually to do that. And so I would really hesitate to ever support anything like that against Ukraine's own wishes, because, of course, it is a state that has agency. But peace, security, dignity, those are all great. And those are all part of what could be a Ukrainian victory. But a Ukrainian victory on Ukraine's terms, and it's been self-defined, is rightfully so, liberation of its territories, in part because we don't, and Ukrainians certainly don't, want to condemn their countrymen to decades of occupation and horrific war crimes and real colonialism, as it were. So why does the Biden White House not ever think of this in terms of political benefits of victory for Biden himself? Boy, it seems like if we were to go quicker, Biden might actually become super popular, that he could stand up and lead the Western Alliance instead of standing next to the Western Alliance and actually get to that point. So I think that really merits discussion as well. And we've pissed away a couple of years already, not getting the sanctions to go fast enough or the weapons to go fast enough. And I think since we're back, I'm back on a university campus or moved to this other university campus, I'm going to go to the board for a second. I think there's a good visual that we can have for this. So, I think how do you describe this confluence between sanctions and weapons? Because you have these two sets of experts that are constantly talking about these issues as if they're decoupled. Well, they're certainly coupled. So it's really a 3x3 matrix, but I will not bore you with the other lines because they're just too depressing out here to consider. But you have, of course, max weapons.
I don't think that
no one can see this.
No, people online can't hear you. So
Oh.
you have to talk on the microphone.
Okay, Mac, can we take this back here? Can people hear me? I don't know
Yeah,
if
there
this
you go.
is on. Hello.
Yep, you're good. It's green, you're good.
All right. Max weapons.
Oh, here we go.
Moderate weapons. Max sanctions and moderate sanctions, right? So, of course, the min of minimizing weapons and minimizing sanctions leads to Ukrainian defeat, and I'm just not going to put it on this board, not at this conference. But maximum weapons and maximum sanctions, that's a fast victory. Moderate weapons, moderate sanctions, these two cross terms give you, maybe moderate, medium Ukrainian victory. And then here's where we are right now. As long as we can. Okay? We want to, it's pretty obvious. We want to be here, not here. Okay? So that's all on the board for now. So look, it just again bothers me that there is a kind of defeatism right now that Capitol Hill can't get it done in terms of military funding and the weapon systems that we can and should be giving very quickly, including ATACMS, including F-16s, and all the sort of things that Ukraine has made it very clear it needs and wants and requires to win and in terms of its own victory. But what could we be doing right now is the question. And I hope that we have a chance to talk about this, but I can just hit some top line ones right now. The Biden administration and our transatlantic partners in Brussels and the EU member states can and should be ramping up sanctions enforcement and sanctions definitions as quickly as possible. And that means, for example, reducing the $60 per barrel Urals oil price cap as quickly as possible, right? And And this is something that we saw Janet Yellen come out last year. The United States in December of 2022 pushing against a lower price cap that countries like Poland and Estonia called for, and setting at 60, which was above the marginal cost of Urals production in the Russian Federation. Poland and Estonia, rightfully so, wanted it closer to 30, so something closer to the marginal cost of production. We haven't moved it. Sanctions can't be a set it and forget it policy. The idea was this was going to be revisited, month after month. I wrote an article right when this came out with Mr. Richard Morningstar of the Atlantic Council that this needs to be revisited quickly. It still hasn't. It's been over a year. What the heck are we doing? And so that's gotta happen. And part of this is what I've been sitting in on and discussing with colleagues for the past 48 hours before this, is this idea of historical memory in Europe, right? And the idea that especially in Germany, there was this notion of Wandel durch Handel, or change through trade. If only we traded with the Russian Federation, to say nothing, of course, of all of the countries in between that don't want that to happen and didn't want things like Nord Stream and all of these quote unquote energy project or commercial energy projects to move forward. That then the Russian Federation would become more like us, more market liberalized, be demonopolized, and all those sort of things. Well, it got worse and worse and worse. And I said yesterday, why are we not looking at this like kind of a problem gambler at a betting table, right? As Putin got worse and worse and worse, these folks kept doubling down and losing their money until eventually this large scale invasion happened. Of course, it happened after these projects went forward. And the reason that I'm concerned about that is I believe there will be a significant segment, and are already a significant segment, that think that there can be a return to business as usual with the Putin regime, which certainly there can't be, especially on energy. And I've debated folks that were supportive of Nord Stream 2 and Gazprom and these sort of pro-Russian energy projects in the past 12 months or so, and they are quick to say, yes, but we certainly cannot have say never, that sort of thing. And I said, we can for the Putin regime, maybe not a future democratized Russia of a different sort completely, if we believe that's possible, which we'll talk about in the next question. But we can't have a return to business as usual, and we need to therefore just bite the bullet and get done the easy work or at least the easy policy decisions that we can make, and get on to the harder work of actually enforcing these sanctions and getting these weapon systems in the Ukrainians' hands.
Thank you very much, Ben. I wonder if either Volodya or Eugene may want to just, like in a sentence, address this last part, like what needs to happen. I think we have a very clear perspective from all of you that, what actually needs to happen, but how do you get there? How do you get from your bottom left quadrant to the top right? Like if we all agree that, the West should commit to Ukraine victory, but it's not committing, right? Like what is it that can be done, be it by experts, be it, as Melinda outlines, specific developments need to happen. Again, very briefly, since we're short on time, but I don't know if either Volodya or Eugene want to say like in a sentence or two.
Sure. Can I do 10 sentences?
No, you cannot. Absolutely not. But you can do 2. 3, okay, I'll give you 3, but that's it.
Okay, I think what is needed is a strategy, and that's not the end of a sentence yet.
Okay.
Yeah, that strategy should be sustained and proactionary, not just waiting for what Russia does, not just being afraid of escalation all the time. It also needs to address the issue in the context of U.S. national interest. I think it's been a major problem for Biden administration that he didn't. For the international audience, defending democracy or rule of law or fighting against war crimes is important, but for a domestic audience, that needs to be framed in a framework of national interest, and that wasn't done properly until quite recent by Biden administration. And finally, weapons. Yeah, of course, if you have some weapons you can give to Ukraine, instead of just scrapping them for the metal, send them to Ukraine. Tightening sanctions, especially going after people who are violating, intermediaries and who are involved in loopholes, and sending stuff to Russia and freezing assets. I think that's a step in the right direction. I would actually like those assets to be used right now to buy weapons for Ukraine, not just wait till the reconstruction of Ukraine for them to be used. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gene, I don't know if you want
to... I agree with Volodya said. That's a great menu right there. The key is, and I referred to this in my earlier comments, is framing the threat correctly, if Russia wins in this war, it sets back U.S. interests globally.
Okay, great. Okay, so for the sake of time, I'm actually going to combine. Thank you, Melinda, for this great suggestion. Since we want to have time for discussion with the audience, I'm going to combine my last two questions into one. And these questions were getting at kind of two things. The first one is having to do with the fact that the summer counteroffensive in Ukraine did not result, as many had hoped, in liberation of the territory in the south. And as Melinda, you said earlier, everybody likes a winner, so that certainly would have helped to kind of galvanize more support for Ukraine. But given that it hasn't happened, and that most military analysts currently agree that neither side has the capacity to decisively shift the battle lines, at least not in the sort of short and medium term, what is the best strategy both for Ukraine, for Ukraine to pursue, and what kind of support the West should be giving? And here we can, I didn't have questions specifically on sanctions, but Ben, if you want to elaborate on that more, that certainly would be a possibility. And then sort of the second part, which was, originally a separate question, but I would like you to address whichever part of these questions you want in your response now, is, of course, the prospects of the 2024 presidential election and the possibility of Trump coming into office. This is the consequence that seems very, very dire to most in Ukraine. Essentially, Putin, from what we can tell, is really hoping for this outcome, and the expectation is that there would be massive, if not a full end, certainly massive reduction of aid to Ukraine, potentially withdrawal of U.S. support, even things such as U.S., withdrawing not just from supporting Ukraine, but from other allies in Europe, even from NATO. He's promised, peace deal with Russia in 24 hours and all this other nonsense. So I guess, again, building on this conversation we were having, what can be done, what should be done? Is there anything that political elites now in U.S., in Ukraine, and other Western countries should be doing that they're not doing? In light of this quite real possibility of this major change in the American political spectrum after the 24 election. So Volodya, will go to you, whichever parts of the question you want to pick up.
Sure. So just one out of two, right?
It's basically it's 3 and 4 kind of, we're combining.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. So in terms of a strategy for the military stuff, the counteroffensive indeed didn't work. That was very unfortunate. Obviously, we had high hopes in Ukraine, and everyone is kind of gloomy right now in the sense of that we lost a lot of our guys and didn't really move too far. So that really changes atmosphere in Ukraine, by the way, and that's reflected already in sociological polls. But we still would like, of course, most Ukrainians would like to liberate all of our territory occupied currently by Russia. But what can you do? I mean, it looks like there is a recognition on both sides of the ocean that we are switching for this year to the active defense instead of trying to be on offensive. It's still going to be hard on Ukrainian forces because it's war of attrition, and that's where you actually see the conflict is asymmetric by default, by definition, and Russia is just stronger in many respects. And that's why Ukraine is going on defense right now. So the major aim, I guess, is to prevent for Russia to grab more land in Ukraine. And it's easier, after all, even in the war of attrition, to be on defensive. So, but that's a temporary decision, I guess, because we're still hoping that maybe at some point in the future, we'll be able to do an offensive again. And actually, being an active defense does not preclude Ukrainian forces from looking for opportunities and windows into trying to do a little offensive here and there. U.S. administration seems to be understanding that as well, and they're making the strategy for this year for Ukraine to be an active defense and assisting Ukraine in that respect. So does it mean that everyone is just giving up on deoccupying the land? I don't think so. But for the moment, I guess this idea of just keeping what you have under Ukrainian control right now would dominate, both in Kyiv and Washington and many other capitals in Europe as well. And I think that would be, that the offensive to liberate the land would be kind of put out of the brackets for the time being. But what needs to be provided? We've already mentioned that. Me and Jean, and so more weapons definitely need to be provided. It's a good step with GLDB bombs, for instance. But now we've learned in Ukraine there is no silver bullet. There's no magic stick, wonder stick, that you can use. Send this weapon to Ukraine and Ukraine wins tomorrow. It's not going to happen, but it's going to assist Ukraine. It's going to help Ukraine, of course. if you increase the reach for Ukrainian strikes and occupied lands, that's going to be a big deal. So moves in that direction, and basically hurrying up with whatever has been delayed, because a lot of weapons have been promised to Ukraine that didn't make it to Ukraine yet. And I'm not even talking about F-16s. I'm talking about some other things that have been promised like a year ago. So that's a big deal. There is a growing understanding in Ukraine. There is a consensus basically in Ukraine that if Ukrainian troops were given the weapons that we already have, say in the fall of 2022, that would be a different ballgame entirely. I mean, Ukraine would probably be just rolling after Kharkiv offensive, liberating Kharkiv region, just keep rolling. And Russians' defensive lines were not established at that point of time. But those weapons were not given in Ukraine in time. But okay, we shouldn't just lament about what didn't happen. We should look forward. In terms of Trump becoming the president, which is a real possibility, I belong to those who think it's going to be a really bad situation for Ukraine, because I see Trump being, persistently anti-Ukrainian leader, from 2016 to 2019, of course, and impeachment hearings and so on. And now he got himself so up on this anti-Ukraine letter with his base, by the way, to the extent of anti-Ukrainian hysteria, which is I'm following the pro-Trump outlets and media sources, and I sometimes think that Kremlin narrative actually coming from Kremlin is milder towards Ukraine than what you're hearing from those circles, and that's very unfortunate. And like I mentioned already before, Biden administration should have been done a better PR job, but communicating better why this war is important, why it's in U.S. interest to support Ukraine. It's only in the recent several weeks, let's say a couple months maybe, that people started talking about, okay, where the money actually ends that you're giving to Ukraine. It actually you're kind of giving it to yourself. Right. So you're creating jobs. You're creating jobs, by the way, in the red states. State of Arkansas, for instance, is very happy that they're producing now more HIMARS and everything. So you need to double down on that message, and then maybe you can reverse at least the trend of Republican base being skeptical of supporting Ukraine. So they're going to be important. If you're Ukraine, you just keep out of Ukrainian domestic politics and maintain those channels to both major political parties. I see some people trying to cozy up to Trump already and flatter him. That's the language he usually understands. I guess Ukraine would have to do that if he becomes a president indeed. I don't think that he would completely stop end of aid to Ukraine, but I think would be a really minimal one. So not enough for us, not systemic, not a level that we would need if this war goes on for years. So I'm really not seeing any possibility for Trump just reversing his policies. Some people say he's so unpredictable. He now says, let's not help Ukraine. He becomes president. He would do 180. He would say, oh, no, let's help Ukraine. Actually, I don't think so. I even think that the people who is his base, who believes that Ukraine shouldn't be helped right now, they would actually have an impact now on him if he would decide that you could support Ukraine. Then the people who voted for him and supported him along the way, they would say, but you said for so long that we shouldn't do it. And there is a serious uprising among certain Americans against the globalism, against interventionism, against, America trying to be involved in various conflicts around the globe. So there is a appetite for America First approach, which Trump never abandoned. And I see this as a serious problem with Ukraine. And of course, without U.S. leadership, which was demonstrated in the last 2 years, and the question was like, can American leadership even be possible? And is it needed? And the answer to both questions, yes. So it's possible, it is needed, but can it be sustained? And what's going to happen if there is a change of guard, in U.S.? It's going to be detrimental, I think, to Ukraine.
Thank you very much for this depressing but realistic assessment of the current state of affairs. Jean.
Yeah, just thank you so much. I'll also combine my responses, but first I'll start with something that Melinda said in her previous intervention, and that was the importance of the cadre issue, investing in experts on the region and specifically on Ukraine. I won't talk about myself, obviously. What I'll mention is that I was fortunate enough when I came to the department, my other capacity, to have started work in something called, I came before the collapse of the USSR. So there was a Soviet nationality section. It was kind of a backwater, quiet, not high profile, but had terrific people there. It was started by someone named Ivan Kapusta, and then had really great people working there later, including Paul Goebel, who's terrific in terms of the nationalities issues. That's the kind of investment that's needed on a grander scale so that people understand not just the things that can be counted, the tangibles, but the intangibles, which have played out so importantly in this current war. In terms of the counteroffensive, I won't dwell too much on what transpired, other than to also suggest that part of the problem was the West not giving Ukraine what it needed, not quickly enough, not fully enough, and that proved inadequate in terms of the fortifications that Melinda mentioned earlier. I should also point out that the adversary, unfortunately, has a vote on how things go in the battlefield, and the Russians decided to fight the Ukrainians in front of the fortification lines and managed to have greater losses than the Ukrainians by far, even when on the defensive. So that's a factor as well. That's in some ways a success story, but obviously overall objectives were not met. In terms of the best strategy for Ukraine, I'll mention several components. These will overlap with what's been said, with what Volodya and others have previewed already in their earlier interventions. So the key is to continue to grow the delta between Putin's objectives and Putin's ability to meet those objectives. Putin is not going to stop at this point. I think it's pretty clear to everyone. He continues to double down for a variety of reasons, in part because he has hung so much of his regime's legitimacy on this war. So the key is to continue to drive that delta to make it as wide as possible. This involves, of course, destroying Putin's troops in Ukraine. He doesn't seem to care about that as much, but it does have an impact over time, especially on the Russian people. Obviously, sustaining and increasing Western military and financial assistance, holding at risk Russian targets in the occupied areas and beyond, and I emphasize beyond. This notion that somehow Ukraine can only strike Russians in Ukraine, but not in Russia in the context of a full-out war is ludicrous. It's nonsensical. I hope for obvious reasons. What needs to be struck with longer range fires are obviously air defense sites, command posts, barracks, logistics, troop concentrations, material concentrations. There are many targets that should be struck to blunt Russia's ongoing offensive efforts, but also to soften the Russian forces for what hopefully will be another Ukrainian attempt to regain territory. There's also an important other aspect, and obviously the Rada is debating the new mobilization law. So mobilizing Ukrainian society further. Someone whose opinion I respect said recently that pretty much everyone is going to have to serve, and that makes sense in the context of war with a country, with an entity like Russia. So, but also mobilizing, training, and equipping more personnel. That's where the West also needs to step up more. The issue of refugees can be controversial. But at some point, obviously, Ukraine, not some point now, Ukraine wants its people to return and to contribute to the economy. That's another aspect to keep in mind. Of course, start using seized Russian assets. This is a no-brainer in many ways, and not just the proceeds from, but the actual principle as well, to help Ukraine recover, but also to help arm Ukraine. I think that would be quite appropriate, as was mentioned earlier. There also needs to be, reform needs to be advanced in Ukraine. This is not something that's popular to say in the context of war, and I say this specifically as an element of victory for Ukraine. Reform needs to continue to advance, and your return to business as usual needs to be headed off for many reasons, but also because so many Ukrainians are fighting and yes, dying at the front lines. Bringing closer Ukraine's membership in the EU and even NATO, that's important. And I believe it can be done for the simple reason that, in my view at least, this war is not going to be over in all of its dimensions until Ukraine is in NATO. How you get there is obviously challenging, but I trust smart men and women can figure that out. Under the current circumstances, and that organization needs to continue to evolve and to address the obvious security deficit in the east of the European continent. And making progress on that front, by the way, is crucial because Putin is trying to prevent it. So it's important to demonstrate to Putin that he will lose, that the West is committed to Ukraine's victory and Putin losing in terms of his efforts to control Ukraine. One other aspect on the domestic front that needs to be addressed, especially over time, is the issue of elections and legitimacy. Elections cannot be held currently under Ukrainian law, of course, and it's completely understandable. But there are other things that can be done to maintain legitimacy in the context of war and not holding elections. And one of those, by the way, is reform again, to continue to reform, to deliver to the Ukrainian people what they want. On the last question, I already referenced some of the challenges that were created
or at least not addressed under the Obama and Biden administrations. The Trump administration, of course, was a particular case study in a number of ways. And yes, you could point to the fact that it was during the Trump administration that the Crimea Declaration, so-called Pompeo Declaration, was issued, that the United States would never recognize Crimea's incorporation into Russia. That was a positive. The provision of the javelins occurred under the Trump administration. And the regular call-outs of Russian bad behavior, especially coming out of the State Department, was at its high point, actually, during the Trump administration as well. We can get into the reasons why that happened then, but there was arguably at the policy level more continuity that changed. That does not mean that everything would be fine in the context of the former president's election going forward. I think we all remember the Helsinki press conference with Putin. If not, please look it up. It was a particular low point, frankly, in my view. In fact, Putin was in this strange situation where he had to help our then president explain what our U.S. policy on Crimea was, which was not a great look. Okay, finally, in anticipation of that possibility, and I generally stay away from political predictions, but in anticipation, since that's the question, I think Ukraine's allies, our allies in Europe and elsewhere, who are also supporters of Ukraine, need to step up and do more to carry more of the load, to take away at least the rhetorical reasoning that others are not doing enough. That's not going to carry the day by itself, but it's something that has to continue to happen. And there are people in Europe who understand that, including in Germany, which is a good sign. Let's see if it can be sustained. It's important to make clear that confronting Russia is critical to confronting other adversaries around the globe. I think that's something that could resonate in that particular camp that we're talking about, and then pursue on a daily basis. And this is where the bureaucracy can play a role underneath the sort of the political level, if you will, to continue to pursue a fuller, more comprehensive decolonization of policy. Which is necessary, just like it is on campuses in terms of curriculum and other respects as well. And the goal of this should be to reduce the Moscow factor, as I call it, but there are other ways to refer to it, to reduce it to as close to nothing as possible.
Thank you very much, Gene. That's a lot of policy recommendations. I hope they're listening to you in Washington. I endorse them all. Belinda, on to you.
So I'm just going to add a few things that I would to Gene's very excellent list. You asked me to do my favorite thing in the world, be an advisor to the Ukrainian government. Okay, here we go. So in October, I went to Zaporizhia and I went to the front lines and I strapped on the gear, and I'm afraid of the dark. So I was nervous the entire time, but I talked to everyone who wanted to talk to someone from the West. And I heard over and over again, this country's not on a war footing. And we've had to stick our necks out for 600 days. These are soldiers and paramedics. And we think this is unfair. We want to go home. We want to see our wives. We want to see our kids. I'm tired of giving music lessons on my iPhone to my kids in Lviv. So we are sick of seeing selfies in Kiev where people are having nice cocktails. And the president should put the economy on a real war footing. And we need to be making shells. We need to be making weapons in Ukraine. So I take that recommendation seriously. I think it's time to put the entire economy on a war footing and to mobilize. I understand it comes with huge, huge societal implications, but this is why I'm an advisor and not a politician. Okay, so the other things that I would put on Gene's excellent list, Ukraine needs to become self-reliant, and they know this and they understand this and they're working on it. So the obvious point in 2024, Ukraine and Russia are both trying to amass as many drones, troops, rockets, and shells. And Ukraine doesn't have enough shells. The EU promised to deliver 1 million shells by March, and they've only delivered 330,000. So Ukraine is going to have to do this. The EU is kind of moving, but they're super slow. The arms, the domestic manufacturing base in Ukraine is really complicated. There's someone who's very, very competent in charge, and that gives me a lot of confidence. But if you look at all the other previous attempts at reforming this agency, There have been many good qualified people. It's really, really hard and it's really slow. And there's huge amounts of waste and huge amounts of old Soviet ways of doing things. So that's a space that I'm watching, and they need to act with more than alacrity. And I'm not even sure what that is. The Ukrainians need to continue to use tech to their advantage, and they've done this brilliantly in the Black Sea. So the Ukrainians don't really have an army, but you wouldn't know it by looking at their results in the Black Sea. And they need to continue to test. Navy, thank you. Continue to contest the Black Sea and use tech to their advantage. Jean's right that they need to become squeaky clean. And there's a lot of different pieces to this. And I'll leave it at continue to make sure that there's real media freedom in Ukraine. Allow opposition MPs to travel. Make Ukraine a place where people want to live. Make it a democratic superpower in Eastern Europe. You have to do this while fighting the war. I'm not saying it's easy. One piece that I think that gets overlooked a little bit, though, is Ukraine needs to attract talent. I want Kiev to be the next Prague once this war is over. I want it to be a place where, when I come here and talk to Ben's students, they're like, God, I can't wait to graduate. I just want to go to Kiev for a couple of years and get involved in rebuilding. So I think that if Ukraine is able to do some of these things, that's a realistic possibility. Okay, now to the unfun subject of Donald Trump. When I go to Kiev, there's a lot of magical thinking. So there's a big group of people. Volodya is not one of them, but a lot of people like to pretend that Trump 2 is going to be like Trump 1. And I know that people in this audience are going to throw things at me when I make the following statement. I made it on MSNBC and people just looked at me and said, "Are you smoking? Are you drunk?" No. Okay. Trump 1 was pretty good on Russia when you look at the policy, not the perfect phone call, not all the smoke and mirrors that we saw. So the policy Jean highlighted, there was a non-recognition policy of Crimea. The EU sanctions on Crimea remained in place, and Trump's administration sent javelins. Obama's administration didn't. The problem, though, is that the Trump administration, the new Trump administration, if he's elected, and that's a big if, they know how to use the apparatus this time. We like to pretend that they're unsophisticated boobs. They're not. They understand how to use government this time, and it's going to be very dangerous. They've made lots of predictions about what they're going to do. Predictions we're all worried about, the sort of core democracy in America. But, as a Ukraine-Russia person, they're going to fire all of the good Russia-Ukraine specialists. And the people that would want to work, the political appointees who would want to work for Donald Trump, don't know anything about Ukraine and Russia. The people in our crowd in Washington will not work for him, even if they're lifelong Republicans. So that really worries me. Trump does not like NATO. I think he will try to find a way to zero out NATO. There's creative ways to do it. The House has tried to protect it. We don't know if it will be held up legally. So watch that space. The one thing I'm not worried about, I'm going to give you a little bit of optimism, Oksana. Okay, so even if Trump says that he's going to cut a magic peace deal in 24 hours, Ukraine has agency. Ukraine is not going to agree to this, right? This is not Yalta. Ukraine is a real country and it gets to represent itself at the negotiating table. Ukrainians are not going to stop fighting. So what do we do about this big mess? Because let's be honest, this is a very dangerous moment for Ukraine right now. This is Melinda, again, not an employee of any organization. We need to organize and we need to fight like hell. The Ukrainian community and friends of Ukraine, I'm a friend of Ukraine, have not organized politically. If we want to make sure that Ukraine has the support it needs, we need to organize politically. We need to call our members of Congress. It's not enough. We need to be talking to our friends who have deep pockets, who are political donors, and make sure that when they have conversations with political candidates, please only give your money to people who support Ukraine. This is an easy conversation. Everyone knows someone who has influence. And I would encourage Friends of Ukraine to start a political action committee. They haven't done it, and this is a giant gaping need, and you have 7 months. Give me a call if you want some help.
Here is a call for action. Thank you, Melinda. I think we have the task ahead of us, but thank you very much for this passionate and very reasonable appeal, I'd say. Ben, on to you.
Well, first of all, I'd say I obviously agree with 100% what Melinda just said. Listen to Melinda is always my first recommendation, and what, of course, Razom. I know you're speaking for yourself, but what Razom is working on is also so very important. I think I'd just say, the point on Trump 1 versus Trump 2 is absolutely merited in part because there was a lot of let's say hysteresis in the system from the the end of the Obama administration, and then also probably traditional GOP minds that had come in as political appointees in the first Trump administration, which, as Melinda rightly says, probably will not, maybe even more than probably, would not be back in the second Trump administration. So whereas you have a lot of these really great things like the Crimea Declaration, like the Nord Stream sanctions, like the javelins finally going to Ukraine and things like that happening in the first Trump administration, which of course is running counter to the narrative that you hear more broadly, given Trump himself is a singular political chaos agent and certainly himself against Ukraine. The administration got a lot of good things done for Ukraine. I don't see that happening again. So I don't think that is something that you can say, well, we might just have a rhetorical blunderbuss at the top that's pro-Putin, and then the rest of the administration would be going along and doing kind of traditional U.S. foreign policy, a U.S. foreign policy approach. I'm that keeps me up at night, certainly. On the side of Biden, I'll just say right now, I saw this on Twitter about a month ago. I don't remember if it was Darth Putin KGB or if it was someone else. I don't remember who said it, but it stuck with me, and it continues to stick with me. That what you are doing now vis-a-vis Ukraine if you ever wonder what you would have been doing during World War II to stand up to Nazi Germany, is you're doing that right now vis-a-vis standing up for or not Ukraine. And that's what you have to remember, because this is, we sometimes act like this isn't the largest ground war in Europe since World War II. It is. And that's why I've been, just astonished that the Biden administration, it took almost 18 months or more to have have President Biden, advise President Biden from the National Security Council or the White House itself to have a Oval Office, direct to camera statement to the nation on why this is so important. That should have happened within 48 hours of rockets hitting Kyiv. Where was it? And okay, let's not damn everyone to hell because it didn't happen. I want to see that, early and often from here on out, until we get to a point where we, again, get from the as long as we can, you are here, to the fast victory for Ukraine. That's got to happen. So yes, I agree with Melinda on putting Ukraine on a war footing. I think that we need to expand that and put the entire transatlantic community on a war footing again, because we are facing the largest ground war in Europe since World War II. And I think that traveling to Europe over the past few years, the recognition was shocking that something was going on, but my contacts have ramped up their understanding of the concerns and the threats. And certainly, we haven't seen a direct attack on NATO or anything like that might ramp up or change the calculus. We have seen critical infrastructure be destroyed again and again before, during, and after Putin's large-scale invasion of Ukraine, all the way from the space domain to subsea telecoms and energy, cables and pipelines and things like this, all of which have been, unexplained. I think that certainly I have some thoughts and analysis on that, but that has to be remembered as well. So on the sanctions front, first and foremost, my goodness, the perpetrator of the crime needs to pay for the crime. Use the assets to support Ukraine's military now. Okay, not just its reconstruction. This idea that somehow we're going to hold all this in reserve and rebuild Ukraine. We will. We're going to need to do that. But this idea of, if you're going to have Ukraine fatigue and you're not using, taxpayers don't want to spend money on supporting Ukraine, are you really going to be able to explain to them that you have some sort of concerns about using not just the proceeds or the luxury tax on these frozen assets, but the principle itself to arm Ukraine now? I mean, my goodness. And of course, it's a win-win in the sense that every dollar we spend to support Ukraine in terms of its military, most of it's going, I don't know what the percentage is. I'm sure that Razan or it's a high percentage, goes to manufacturing in the United States or in Europe and in the countries of the NATO alliance. So we need to do that. I'll add a live policy recommendation because I've been thinking about this and talking about it for the past few days. There was a Klimastiftung, a climate foundation that was set up as basically a fake front using 99.9% Gazprom money in the German state of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern to the tune of around 20 million euros that was set up to try to circumvent U.S. sanctions, basically have a drop of German state government money involved so that the U.S. would not sanction this entity or the vessels that, or a vessel in this case, this vessel called the Blue Ship that it purchased. Well, guess what? Number one, that decision, which still has not been righted and should be righted, could easily be righted, has undermined our counter-threat financing regimes for a long time because it points out to an adversarial nation or authoritarian nation that all it needs to do is set up some sort of organization or front or something in a Western ally of the United States and then get a drop of local money involved, and therefore the United States doesn't sanction our allied governments, and therefore it's safe. That can't be allowed to continue, and certainly mandatory sanctions from bipartisan majority in both chambers of Congress have pointed this out, and that needs to be rewritten. But in addition to that, why not have Germany freeze that 20 million and send it back to supporting Ukraine? So take Gazprom money directly, and that was trying to build Nord Stream 2 and send in support Ukraine. There's I'm sure many dozens of other situations like this that we can look at. But again, on the sanctions front, enforcement is key. If we truly enforce what we already even have on the books, that might be enough to really significantly undermine the war effort from the Putin regime. This, of course, includes using commercial space assets and calling on commercial space companies to help with offshore monitoring of technology export controls in oil and gas and other hydrocarbon circumvention of sanctions. The less materiel that the Putin regime is able to physically get in to support its war effort, the more you get and change the calculus on the battlefield itself, especially if you're not able to get funding for military equipment as quickly as you'd like. And we just have to remember that this is truly existential and part of the Ukrainian war effort. This is not just some sort of policy apparatus that's sitting on the side. The sanctions need to be enforced robustly and enforced quickly, because if we don't do that, we cede ground to folks in the academic community, folks in the policy community, et cetera, that are trying to say that sanctions don't work, sanctions shouldn't be used, et cetera, which again in many cases reflect the Kremlin line on this. And the last but not least, I just want to close this before we go to questions with saying that conferences like these are so important because for too long our discussion on European security and transatlantic security has focused, unfortunately, and I'm a former Fulbright fellow that worked at the Max Planck Gesellschaft in Germany, et cetera, and have worked for U.S.-German relations my entire career. U.S.-European academia can't just be about the U.S.-German relationship. And just as the U.S. Understanding of Eastern Europe can't just be about Russia. There are voices from Central and Eastern Europe, from Northern Europe, the Nordic countries, et cetera. All of these need to be integrated together with Germany's view and make sure that we don't have a foreign policy like we've seen quite a few decisions with the Biden administration that reflect what Angela Merkel or Olaf Scholz specifically want, vis-a-vis one that actually is a foreign policy that integrates a Europe whole, free, and at peace. That means the entirety of the European Union. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ben. Let's thank all the panelists for their insightful comments on all the questions. Okay. So we will now go to Q&A. Since we started a little later and we had ambassador remarks, maybe we'll go to like 12:15. Emily, is that okay? Yeah. And other microphones around? Yes. Okay. We'll start. Maria, please go ahead. Maria Slavitsky. Maria at the back there. Yeah. Yeah, maybe.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. This question is for anyone who wants to take it up. There's been a movement among Ukrainian activists that has intensified since February 2022 to cancel Ukraine's foreign debt. Their argument goes that servicing IMF debts and the conditions attached to repaying these loans, which often include neoliberal pro-business reforms, is in fact a form of neocolonial dependency. So this is rather far from my area of expertise. I'd love to hear you appraise that argument.
Okay,
Thanks.
let's maybe take one or two more questions. Yes, go ahead in the back there. Yeah, in the white sweater. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Petro Kocherhan, Harvard Business School. Appreciate amazing discussion here. Thank you for all the support you've given to Ukraine. I'll be bringing maybe like a different lenses to that. I believe that the Biden administration's great intentions towards Ukraine, but what we are seeing on this 2x2 is that there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think when we raise the topic, for instance, of like Ukrainian self-reliance in carrying on with the war, not a single military analyst is in fact underwriting the strategy that Ukraine can in fact win this war, relying only on its own merits, on its own industrial complex. And here again, the big question is: don't you think that the U.S. administration and perhaps Trump will be the right person to do that? By the way, I'm not by any chance think it's a great solution for Ukraine in the long term, but don't you think we need more intellectual honesty in the conversation between Ukraine and the U.S., saying that's exactly what we can do, that's what we cannot do? Because once Ukraine in this, between black and white, somewhere in the middle, I have a feeling that Ukrainians don't understand how much support we can get from the U.S. And for that, we cannot also plan and have this honest conversation among ourselves. How are we going to win this war? I want to bring the country to victory. So your take here, isn't it like, no, we need to be more realistic in some extent? I understand that we need to try to lobby for more support, and it's everything everyone here is doing. But again, I have a feeling that there is lack of this intellectual honesty a bit in the conversation, and maybe either the Biden's administration or the one that will come in a couple of months will be able to facilitate this discussion.
Just for the sake of time, we're going to take Serhiy for his question, and then we'll have the panelists answer. Then we'll go to next round. No, you don't want. Okay. Let's just let's take these two questions. Whichever one of you wants to take which part of the questions.
No.
Okay.
Go for it.
Sure. Yes. No, good questions in terms of understanding some of the complexities. Of course, I'm in no position to really answer the debt question. I'm taking one for the team here. Maybe I'll buy them a little bit of time to try to address it. The thing is that there are several fronts in this regard. One is the seized Russian assets. Another is the sort of bilateral, multilateral assistance, financial assistance to Ukraine already, and then the issue of the debt before the IMF. The IMF has its own expectations and rules, and while it might be tempting to say yes, cancel it and move on, there are other equities involved that I'm not really equipped to address there. Perhaps that's something that could occur in the context of the other fronts moving forward in terms of the seizures of Russian assets, or perhaps it would something that might have to wait until later in this process. And I only say that with regret in some respects because Ukraine needs help now in this regard as well. But I would just add that the IMF program is also an important tool to I don't want to say force, but to secure additional reforms. And that could be a slippery slope in that regard if this issue is resolved now by canceling the debt. That's my stab.
I'll just say that point is incredibly important, and I haven't followed this with the level of rigor that is needed to respond to what the academics that are calling for that are using in terms of their legal justification. But Jean's point of IMF funding and international, financial institution support of Ukraine being used as kind of the carrot to the reform efforts that have been ongoing in Ukrainian democracy for the past decade, and and need to continue, certainly. And no one, I think, none of us up here on this panel would say that Ukraine is done in terms of its anti-corruption and rule of law and all those other good reform efforts that need to go on. But they've done a massive job. I mean, in the energy sector alone, remember that the years running up to the large scale invasion saw the unbundling of Naftogaz between its transmission system operator, the gas transmission system operator of Ukraine, and Naftogaz, the principal energy producer in that sense, because it's trying to assure that its Euro-Atlantic aspirations in the future are possible, and a significant portion of this stems on systemic and structural reforms to make sure that the Ukrainian energy system is in line with the EU third energy package and all of its rules and responsibilities. And I think we saw some really tremendous work on the technical side of things right as the war was starting, literally within the first 48 hours to the first week, in which trying to integrate Ukraine's physical energy system with that of Europe was attempted and succeeded. The synchronization of the Ukrainian grid with the European Union's grid. That was something that I remember working on these issues with trying to uncouple the Baltic states from the Brel system, the Belarus, Russia, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia system, to the European grid via Poland. That's still going on in the Baltic states because they don't have as existential a crisis right now to do so, but they certainly are trying to fast track as much as possible in light of the large scale invasion. But when we then talked about what Ukraine should do this as well, and Ukraine wants to do this as well, it was unclear if that would ever happen, if Ukraine could ever synchronize its electricity grid with the European market. They did it in 48 hours.
Just for the sake of
That's
time,
it.
because
Yeah.
we want to take more questions. Melinda or Volodymyr, do you want to take?
I'll take it really fast. Okay, so I think we have to remember that there's more than one track of discussion. So the Ukrainian government and the United States government have an excellent relationship, and we are not privy to their discussions. From what I know, which is very little, the discussions are real. There's a lot of trust. And I think especially on the weapons side, there's a huge amount of trust, and people are working around the clock at DoD. But I like the question. I like the spirit of the question, but I don't think it really reflects the reality of the war. So I think it's an ongoing process. And us as a community, we have to keep pushing like hell. So every time I see the Biden administration give and say, okay, fine, we'll give ATACMS. Every time they relent, it's because of public pressure. So I think they're having realistic conversations, but I think it's up to us as a community to make sure that the U.S. government does everything it can. And I have to run to the airport. I'm not afraid of hard questions, but I have to run to the airport.
Okay, well, I think you took a hard question here, but thank you, Melinda. Volodya, do you want to say anything?
No, I think we should move to more questions.
Next. Okay.
Yeah.
Sergey, do you still want to ask your question? Yeah. Okay. Okay. And then you. Okay.
Thank you. First of all, there was a lot of said about the really risks and dangers coming with second Trump administration, and Melinda was very good formulating those. The question that I have is maybe impossible to answer at this point. That's why I vacillated. But what one should expect from second Biden administration? And is this basically a better choice than we would have with Trump, and we should stop there? Whether there will be more of the same, or there can be improvement, or things can actually get worse. Again, I understand how difficult the question is. It's difficult to predict things, especially difficult to predict future. But here is my question.
Okay. Thank you for succinct question. Asking succinct questions and giving succinct answers might get us through another round. Okay, yes, please, over there, and then in the back here. This guy in black shirt here.
Hi, thank you. This is for Mr. Schmidt and his great graphic back there. The main thing that I've so far seen with the ATACMS and the F-16s is the potential of U.S. weaponry flying into Russia proper and maybe U.S. reservations with that. Is there any way of sort of convincing the U.S. that that might not be, or is there any way of like reconciling that between the U.S. and Ukraine so that the weapon flow moves faster? And then the other thing is that with the potential of Trump coming in and his army of deep state rubber stampers, is there any way to maybe get a faction or a sub-faction of that group to understand the gravity of, the international gravity of what we're doing in Ukraine? Thank you.
And then one more, just that gentleman in the back, yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that we started this whole panel with a kind of a diplomatic introduction in the U.S. policy for Ukraine. We also talked a lot about the economic policies, and we got this beautiful chart there. And we also talked a lot about military part of the United States policies. But I would like speakers to maybe give some thoughts about the informational part of this whole thing, because I feel like at the beginning of the conversation, we briefly mentioned this LOL kind of like Russian narratives that we still, by the way, discussed, which I think it's from the point of view Russian narratives is a great success. So I was wondering if there are any comments on the actual informational policies in the United States, specifically. We do see Russia interfering in the United States elections. We do see all those essentially informational attacks on NATO, on the United States, on the democratic world itself. But we don't really see the, so to speak, informational counteroffensive to all those threats. So I was wondering if speakers could say something about that. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to start, Eugene?
Let's see if Volodya wants to start.
Okay, maybe Volodya. Yeah.
Since he didn't speak up last time.
That's right.
Okay, very quickly on the last question. I don't think that Russian propaganda is a great success. I think actually they failed badly in the last 2 years. They did definitely fail with Western audiences in Europe and North America. But if you talk about Global South, that's also more of partially what might look like their success is well-established message that they sent there for years, if not decades. So the Russian narrative was present there. And being also used, as we've discussed, answering the first question, in a number of countries. But I don't think it's a great success. Actually, I think a lot of people, Russian propagandists, are clearly irritated about them misfiring and not being successful, not reaching the audiences. But as for the Global South, yes, well, I mean, of course, if some people are convinced that the U.S. and others in the West supporting Ukraine, they are imperialists, and Russia and before them Soviet Union and Moscow positioned themselves as a defender of those countries that used to be colonies and so on. You cannot change that view overnight. So there's been attempts by Ukraine to do that, and there've been attempts by U.S. do that. And the Secretary Blinken actually had been in Africa, I think, several times in the last 2 years. So there's a recognition that Global South might be important in that conversation to be had, but I don't think we can actually come to the conclusion that Russian propaganda is complete success. On the risk, on Sergei's question of the risks of the second Trump administration, I think there are many. I think that one thing.
It was second Biden administration. Volodya.
Yeah, right. So I think that Biden will actually build up on the current policy, which is not not 100% great as we see it from Ukraine, but it's still based on understanding why you need to support Ukraine, why is it in American interest, how is it related to European Euro-Atlantic security, how it is that's something that you need to do to continue to help Ukraine. There'll be shortcomings, but those shortcomings are really small in comparison to possible new administration that would not understand why Ukraine needs to be helped. Why do we even need to care about Euro-Atlantic security? might go back to conversation about U.S. withdrawing from NATO. So to the extent that the Congress actually had to weigh into this conversation, not allowing a president to do it, just by his voluntary decision. So there's going to be problems with Biden administration, maybe, and there may be smaller levels of support for Ukraine. The war goes on, and Biden is still president 2025. There might be more reasons for us in Ukraine to be disappointed with something not given and not given on time. But that's really, if Biden is not the president, then the pro-Ukraine coalition of countries that the U.S. put together is no more. And that's very important, that both sides of Atlantic should work together in a certain synchronicity and synergy, rather than to support Ukraine. If there is a new president in 2025, that's not going to happen. That's for sure. So, that's a problem. And that's why, Biden, even perhaps not perfect, is still the better choice going forward.
Thank you. Eugene, do you want to, or when?
Sure, I'll jump in to follow up on what Volodya just said. So thank you, Sergei, for asking this question, just at the very least, because of the nonpartisan aspect, asking about both possibilities. It's important to consider. Difficult to predict, many variables, of course, in play, as you acknowledged. One has to assume a certain degree of continuity, but there are aspects that challenge that. So one is, maybe an obvious one, is the extent to which there are personnel changes in the administration, at the Department of State, at the NSC, and elsewhere, where the current incumbents stay or go, and what the views of others who backfill for them may be. That's one aspect to consider. The administrations, if the Biden administration comes back for a second term, what is the organizational principle for its overarching agenda? Where do foreign affairs fall into that? And what else is happening, frankly, in the world at that point? Many sort of the bigger questions out there. One of those reference points is NATO's eastern flank, and how our allies in the eastern flank perceive the administration, because those who are concerned about one candidate becoming president may sense a brief sigh of relief, and may lose sort of focus on the broader aspect and the need to resource this, pushing back against Russia in a much greater scale than is currently the case. On the other questions, just to the informational dimension. I mean, it plays out in so many different ways. It's one of the dimensions of this war, and it's one of the reasons why this ongoing war is actually not just Russia's war against Ukraine, but Russia's war against all of us. That's something to keep in mind. There are some very good folks who are working on these issues. There's one I'll mention a particular institution just for the Global Engagement Center, resident in the State Department, but brings together professionals from a variety of backgrounds and fields. There's a recent report they may have seen on the century of Russian anti-Semitism that just came out recently. An important and timely conversation to be had, no doubt. But anyway, it's not an uncontested space, and I have to agree with Volodya. Russia has not been completely successful, but because spreading lies is easier than doing many other things, it's a real challenge, and that's a challenge. To get back to the earlier question as well, externally and internally, in this country as well. And I won't say more about that. And just finally, just a request not to use the term Russia proper, because there's no Russia improper in a sense. It's either Russia or Russian occupied territories. I would just suggest that up to you what you say, of course.
Thank you very much, Eugene. I think your comment also actually speaks to the issue of intellectual honesty. I'm not sure what sort of exactly was meant by this, but I think it's one thing to say that, yes, there are difficulties, but these are the stakes, right? Like you're saying, Russia is at war, not just with Ukraine, but it is in war with democratic Western system. That's part of the intellectually honest conversation, right? Then we can say, like, okay, there are obstacles to having Western leaderships, they see it this way, right? That's also part of intellectual honest conversation. So, I mean, again, I don't know, I was a little, I'm not a panelist, but I'm sort of stealing my speaker thing. But I just want to emphasize, I think the question is good, but I think what we call intellectual honesty, we really kind of ideally would have had more time to discuss. And I think intellectuals calling the real stakes in the problem. And then, as Melinda said, maybe pushing for this course to change is also part of intellectual, honest conversation. So I'll leave it at that. Ben, you have the last word on this set of questions.
I just hopefully get one last set, so I'll go very fast. I agree totally with what you said, Oksana. I mean, intellectual honesty also means intellectual honesty in the answer to the question, do you really think that if Vladimir Putin's regime is able to solidify and lock in its gains that it had illegally in Ukraine or dominate or take the whole country so that we can then have a ceasefire and peace? Do you really think that's going to make NATO more safe? Do you think that's going to bring stability to the region? Or do you think that's going to make the situation much more precarious along NATO's eastern flank? I think that it's certainly the latter, and we need to be very, very clear early and often with that for folks that are kind of just quote Ukraine fatigued and tired of this. The only folks that can claim Ukraine fatigue if they choose are Ukrainians. That's it. The rest of us have a duty to support them as long as possible, not because it's in their interest, because it's in our own selfish interest for our security. So that's that. The answer to your question is just basically agreeing with what Jean said. The idea that Ukrainians should be told to have one hand tied behind their back and have these systems only used in inside of Ukraine's 1991 territorially internationally recognized boundaries is not how you fight a war, and it's disingenuous and dangerous to say the least. The Ukrainian government seems very clear that it does not want to march on Moscow, so it's not as if that you unleash this Pandora's box and suddenly Kyiv is on the outskirts of Moscow with these systems. It's rather that the systems that are targeting not only Ukrainian service members but civil infrastructure and civilians themselves. There are a lot of them over the border inside the Russian Federation.
Thank you very much. We are now at 12:15. Emily, shall we end? Yeah. Okay. So let's thank the panelists for their great contributions.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for your attention. Thank you, Oksana, for the questions and the moderating. We will reconvene here at 2:00 for our final panel. So please enjoy lunch on your own. The sun is out today, so have a nice time exploring.